Well, good evening, everyone from Berlin, and good day to those of you who are on the east or west coast of the United States. I welcome all of you warmly to the CNS seminar on Syria's chemical weapons, disarmament, past achievements, and ongoing challenges. My name is Hanna Notte. I'm a senior non-resident scholar at CNS. In particular, I would like to welcome Joby Warrick, whose book we'll discuss today and who I will introduce in a few minutes. Just before we start, a few housekeeping rules. Can I ask everyone who's not speaking to please mute their microphones? This event will last for 90 minutes. It's going to be recorded, and we will get to the question portion in the second half of the event after a guided conversation that I will conduct with Joby on the book. Now, once we do get to the Q&A section, please use the hand raising feature in Zoom to pose a question or make yourself known to me. And as I said, please be sure to be muted when you're not speaking. If you face any technical difficulties throughout the event, you can contact my colleague, Caitlin Emmons, through the chat function, and she will be able to assist you. And with that, let us begin. The Syrian chemical weapons issue has been a source of friction, significant friction between especially Russia and Western countries over recent years, especially at the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, the OPCW in The Hague, but also at the UN Security Council. Because even though Syria, with the help of the international community, had removed and destroyed its chemical weapons, or what it declared to be its chemical weapons back at the time, there have since then been repeated allegations against Syria about the incompleteness and inaccuracy over its declarations, but also regarding continued chemical weapons use in Syria, mainly by the Syrian government, but also to some extent by armed groups. Now, the OPCW and the UN Security Council then created a variety of mechanisms over the years to address these issues. And while there was initial cooperation with Russia, for instance, in setting up a so-called fact-finding mission in 2014, or the JIM, the Joint Investigative Mechanism in 2015, really what we've seen since 2016 is Russia and Western states on a firm collision course over Syria in the OPCW. And to my mind, that collision has manifested itself in three primary dimensions. The first dimension has been an institutional standoff in the OPCW over the mandate of that organization to investigate chemical weapons use in Syria and to attribute responsibility for such use. The second dimension has been an increasingly ugly information war regarding who's actually using chemical weapons in Syria. And the third dimension has been a military escalation. You will all recall that the Trump administration launched airstrikes against Syrian targets after chemical weapons were used in Khan Sheikhoun in Syria in April 2017, and then a year later in Douma in April 2018. And in fact, today, just 2 weeks before the Conference of States Parties of the OPCW reconvenes for its annual conference later in April, this contestation over Syria's compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention stands as acute as ever, because a group of states parties are now threatening to sanction Syria in the OPCW, which would be an unprecedented step. And I would also say that this entire dispute over Syria in the OPCW has been compounded in recent years over allegations that Russia has been poisoning Sergei Skripal and his daughter in the UK in 2018, and then, of course, more recently, Alexei Navalny in Russia last fall. Now, if we go back just a few years to 2013, 2014, the picture looked really rather different. Because following the horrendous chemical weapons attack in eastern Ghouta in Syria in August 2013, which killed an estimated 1,300 civilians, we had unparalleled international cooperation in the destruction of Syria's chemical weapons as they were declared by the government at that time. And that cooperation was led by the United States and Russia. You might recall, thinking back to that summer, that after this tragedy in Eastern Ghouta, there was really a heated debate in the United States, in Washington, about the need for a military strike against Syria to give credence to President Obama's Red Line speech that he had made about a year before that. And as that debate was raging, and there were questions as to whether Obama should go to Congress with the issue, and as the United Kingdom was signaling that it would not support military action in Syria, this notion of jointly destroying Syria's chemical weapons with the Russians came up. And there was then really fast diplomacy in Geneva in September 2013, involving American and Russian diplomats to come to an initial agreement of how one would do that. And just 2 weeks later, you had a UN Security Council resolution and an OPCW Executive Council decision, which provided the legal basis for this disarmament mandate in Syria. And you then had Washington and Moscow cooperating practically, operationally with the joint mission and other countries, with an OPCW UN joint mission in subsequent phases of locating, verifying, removing, destroying these chemical weapons. And given the extraordinary task at hand at the time, meaning you had to destroy these chemical weapons in an active war zone, an unprecedented decision was taken to transport the most dangerous materials out of Syria's territory and destroy them on board of a specially commissioned American ship, the Cape Ray, after an elaborate maritime mission to transport the stuff out of Syria. Now, we are honored today to have with us Joby Warrick, who has written the most detailed account of this Syrian disarmament operation to date in his latest book entitled Red Line, The Unraveling of Syria and America's Race to Destroy the Most Dangerous Arsenal in the World. Joby Warrick is a best-selling author and a national security correspondent for The Washington Post. He's a two-time Pulitzer Prize winner. He served for 24 years with the Post's national and investigative staffs, reporting from Washington and scores of cities across the globe. He's been writing on topics ranging from Middle East conflict and terrorism to nuclear proliferation and climate change. And in addition to the latest book, which we are discussing today, he has also written two other nonfiction books, including The Triple Agent, that's a book of 2011, a New York Times bestseller about a CIA operation in Afghanistan, and then Black Flags of 2015, which is a narrative about the personalities and events that gave rise to the Islamic State, and that received the 2016 Pulitzer Prize for General Nonfiction. Joby, we are thrilled to have you with us today. I want to hand it over to you for some introductory anecdotes from the book, please.
Well, thank you very much, Hanna. And I couldn't have asked for a better setup for this talk. I really appreciate that introduction and all the work that you do, because you are quite the expert on this subject. And I have to thank Bill as well, who's been a longtime friend and colleague, for his support, and for my many friends at CNS. I see many of your names popping up, and I know a lot of you know a lot more about chemical weapons than I'll ever know. And so what am I doing here on this side of the camera? But I'm glad you're here, and I'm looking forward to your questions later on. Just to have to commend Bill's little team or growing team at CNS, because you are, for us in my business who have to cover these issues, your support is absolutely essential, and you help us in so many ways. Figuring out what's going on in places like Iran and North Korea, and places that we haven't begun to think about seriously. And so as Hanna said, I'm actually going to just open with a couple of anecdotes, because while Hanna and so many of you know these details so well, my role really is a storyteller. And so I've had the privilege, and it was a privilege, to be able to travel around the world and to speak to many people who are involved in these operations, from American intelligence operatives and engineers to Syrian activists, to inspectors on the ground, and to try to weave together a story about how this happened, how this remarkable set of events took place in 2013 and 14, and how it succeeded in what it was setting out to do, and then ultimately how it it was overshadowed by greater tragedies and problems within Syria, including continued defiance of the chemical weapons taboo. And so the personalities I talk about are not some of the big names. They're not presidents and prime ministers necessarily, but we talk about, a man named, actually, I'm going to show you quickly a couple of pictures, and I'm almost forgetting to do that, but I'm going to share a screen because I love to show pictures, and I've got some ones of the people that I talk about today. Just if you get the book and you get to leaf through it, you'll see some remarkable pictures of inside some of these chemical weapons facilities that haven't really seen the light of day outside of the sort of the notebooks of inspectors who were on the ground and the Syrians themselves. Give me a second, and skip. All right. So anyway, I'm going to talk about some of the couple of my favorite people who were involved in this story, just because their stories were so compelling to me, and it's a side of arms control that we don't often hear about and read about. And so I'm going to start with this individual whose name is Åke Sällström. He's a Swedish medical professor and a veteran of weapons inspection teams in Iraq. And he's tapped by the UN for what seems to be a dead-end mission to investigate early reports of chemical weapons use in Syria. He arrives in Syria and is completely stonewalled at first. The Syrians tell him, "We have no chemical weapons, end of story." And he's getting ready to leave, pack up and go back home. And then as he's there, the night he's getting ready to leave, there's this horrific chemical weapons attack that takes place in eastern Ghouta, in the outskirts of Damascus. The UN inspectors can actually see the rocket strikes from their hotel windows, and they get a sense right away that something unusual happens. What exactly it wasn't clear right away. But the next day when dawn breaks, it's clear this is no ordinary attack. More than 1,000 people, perhaps 1,400, have been killed by poison gas. Many of them are women and children, some of them still in their pajamas because they were sleeping in basements, and sarin being heavier than air, filters down into these subterranean structures where a lot of them had been seeking shelter from artillery fire. So Sällström's immediate impulse is to go to the crime scene and collect evidence. This is the reason he had come to Syria in the first place. But his presence in Syria becomes a controversy because the Syrians don't want him to have this kind of open-ended access to roam around the country looking at these attacks. And President Obama in Washington wants him out because the Obama administration is seriously preparing for what they think is going to be a missile strike. And Sällström is one of the issues, one of the complicating factors that are in the way. Because if you have fact finders on the ground that are collecting evidence, it's bad optic to be sending military missile strikes into the country before they finish their work. There's also concern about hostage taking or the use of these inspectors as human shields. So, but the Swedish professor continues to insist, and eventually he wins permission to leave Damascus and go to these rebel towns where the attacks took place. But he goes unarmed on his own, with no military escorts and no security. And this is real bravery, and this is one of the reasons I really came to admire him in his story. There's a fateful moment early in the expedition as the UN team's convoy is preparing to leave Damascus proper to cross no man's land to go to some of these villages. And I describe it in the book as like this. The lead vehicle comes under attack. Bullets smack against the car's frame, the tires, the passenger windows, the windshield. The glass is shatter-resistant and designed to hold up against small arms fire, but only to a degree. Now it's starting to crack and weaken. The UN convoy quickly turns around and heads back to a military outpost. The narrative picks up at the point where Sällström and two of his advisors are sitting at this outpost trying to decide what to do next. There was a man named Mohammed Kafaji who was most familiar with the local terrain because he was a UN security expert on the ground. And Sällström turns to him with his most pressing question. "What do we do, Mohammed?" he asked. And Kafaji doesn't hesitate. "We go in again," he said. "What?" Sällström was incredulous. "If we don't go today, we'll never go," Kafaji said. "And they'll know that they can frighten us and your mission will be over." Sällström sat quietly thinking. He was being asked to send his team back down a road where a waiting sniper was merely the only threat of which they were absolutely certain. "Okay," he said, "we go in." Moments later, the Toyotas lined up again for a fresh attempt to cross into rebel territory. This one would look markedly different. Rather than cautiously feeling their way through no man's land, they would dash across it like inmates on a prison break. Kafaji grabbed a spare armored jacket and, scooting down in his seat, used his feet to press it up against the windshield. Team members in the other cars did the same. And when everyone was ready, the SUVs passed the checkpoint and then tore down the narrow road with as much speed as they could muster. The vehicle shot across the bridge and did not slow down until all four was on the other side. This time, no shots were fired. That's bravery. Now, evidence is found and collected, and as history records, Obama decides not to enforce his red line threat with a missile strike. And instead, a deal is struck. It's a murky deal, and I describe it in some detail in the book, how it came about and how it was negotiated. But it's a deal to do something that's never been attempted before, and which sounds pretty much impossible. There would be no missiles if Syria would submit to removal and destruction of its entire chemical arsenal, which is its main strategic weapon system, a weapon system it has never acknowledged having. It has to happen in 9 months, and it has to happen in the middle of a war. Another hero. We meet an international team that's hastily assembled to oversee this mammoth task, and they're guided by this remarkable Dutch diplomat, Sigrid Kaag. Kaag is a UN official who has no military experience and no familiarity with chemical weapons, but she has the mental toughness to go head-to-head with leaders of Syria's notoriously brutal and very much male-dominated regime. She quickly discovers that no one really thinks that Syria will give up its weapons, and many countries would prefer to see the deal collapse. The fact is, she later told me, almost no one connected to this mission really wanted it to succeed. We meet Sigrid in Syria at a particularly bleak moment in 2013. The book describes the predicament that she and her fellow inspectors find themselves in. There's a freak autumn snowstorm that had closed the mountain passes to the west for nearly a week, blocking needed supplies coming into the country from Lebanon. Flatbed trucks arriving for transport duty were found to be missing steering wheels and other key parts. Procurement offices struggled to find adequate numbers of storage tanks, cranes, forklifts. Rebel armies were suddenly on the march in the north and east, harassing military convoys and advancing within striking distance of the weapons themselves. And the Syrians, pliant at first, now balked at minor requests while bombarding Kaag with a never-ending list of demands: more armor, more heavy equipment, more time. It was not yet clear how the chemicals could be physically removed and where they would go and how they would be safeguarded along the way. The OPCW experts knew their job, but the agency lacked the resources, the expertise, or even a good plan for eliminating 1,300 tons of deadly chemicals. Kaag would later say, it was like bringing a patient to a non-existent hospital, or like trying to take a trip when there's no plane and no crew and no one who even knows how to fly. And yet these teams persist. They crisscross hundreds of miles of contested terrain, sometimes so close to the fighting that they can hear the salvos from artillery duels whistling overhead. Their hotel comes under attack. They're targeted by Al-Qaeda and trailed by Syrian secret police. And when progress with Syria appears to stall completely, they revert to the role of being diplomats, haggling with the Russians, haggling with the Arab League, anyone who could nudge the Syrians a step closer to the declared goal. Now, Kaag and her deputies would drive across Damascus to seek help from the only two countries that possessed the leverage and clout to change Assad's behavior. Kaag became a regular visitor to the Iranian embassy, where the bearded ambassador would offer sympathetic ear and trays of roasted pistachios, only to complain afterward that Kaag's dress was too short and she had allowed too much of her blonde hair to spill out from under the head covering that she dutifully wore. The Russian embassy was further away, outside the Damascus Green Zone, in a neighborhood that still received occasional incoming fire from rebel skirmishers. The main embassy building was protected behind a fortress-like barrier, a high cement wall at the ground level, topped by a steel fence crowned by concertina wire. The compound was regularly struck by stray shells and bullets, and yet the Russians routinely refused to allow Kaag's vehicle inside, forcing her to park on the street and scurry through a maze of sandbags and two sets of outer gates to gain entrance. During one visit, a mortar exploded a few yards from the sandbag footpath, forcing everyone to dive for cover. Kaag, more annoyed than shaken, brushed herself off and pushed on. The visits were occasionally worth the trouble. The Russian ambassador was the dean of the diplomatic corps in Syria and a man with unrivaled connections among the country's elites. A fluent Arab speaker with polished manners and a trim mustache, he had served multiple postings in Syria since the 1970s, and he'd known Bashar al-Assad as a boy. He would listen to his visitors' complaints with a world-weary air. "I'll see what I can do," he'd say. Exactly what he did was never clear, but suddenly, days after the missed December 31st deadline, Syria announced it was beginning to move some of its chemicals to the port at Latakia. The change was so abrupt that the Joint Mission Team had to finalize the arrangements in a hurry for a pickup. The Cape Ray was still being loaded and tested in Southern Virginia, nearly 6,000 miles away. But a fleet of volunteer ships from a half dozen countries lay moored off the Syrian coast, waiting with impatience and trepidation for this signal to come ashore. And thus begins the physical removal of the liquid sarin precursors from sarin, a country at war, a country that until a few weeks earlier had never acknowledged having chemical weapons at all, a country where large swaths of the landscape were already falling under the control of militants loyal to Al-Qaeda or to the Islamic State, groups that had sought chemical weapons before and who regarded the acquisition of these weapons not just as an opportunity, but as a religious duty. And I'll end my narrative here and look forward to our conversation.
Thank you so much, Joby. Thanks for these excellent anecdotes about Åke Sällström's mission and then also Sigrid Kaag leading the joint mission at the time. I think the way we'll proceed now is that I will engage in a conversation with you, asking you a few questions about different aspects of the book, and then we'll open it up to the audience for further questions. So I want to start really building on the anecdotes that you just told us and ask you, to me, the power of your book partially derives from your ability to tell this amazing Syrian chemical weapons disarmament effort through the experiences and fates of individuals. Like, for example, a young doctor in Eastern Aleppo who's trying to get ready himself and make others ready to deal with victims of chemical attacks, or a young Iraqi who, by virtue of his skill set, he's a trained geologist, ends up as a chemical weapon engineer for the Islamic State, literally because he's worried about otherwise losing his job. So I want to ask you, which part of your field work, which individuals you encountered that you spoke with left the deepest and long-lasting impression on you and sort of contributed the most to your experience in writing this book?
Well, it so happens that you mentioned two of my favorites, and we talked about some of the inspectors, and there's some great American characters. But the Syrians and the Iraqis that I met really affected me in a profound way. And you mentioned this young doctor. His name was Hussam al-Nahas. He's actually here in the United States now. He got a fellowship at Johns Hopkins, and he's getting his master's in public health degree on top of his medical degree now. And what was amazing about him is he's someone who did not want to get involved in this at all. He was just trying to finish his medical internship. And then the war happens and suddenly he's thrust into it. He has some of his medical friends, his doctor colleagues are captured one day by some Syrian thugs. They're found to have medical equipment in their car. So they're taken out and tortured and then shot and set on fire, and their bodies are dumped in front of the hospital with their medical IDs on top of the corpses. And so that moment just turns his life around, and he's decided that he will from then on be an activist, an opposition figure while continuing to be a doctor. And the way he decided to do it, the way he thought he could help the most, was to sort of sound the alarm about this chemical weapon threat, which he knew was real. He could see the reports of small attacks taking place across the country. And so began to work with the international organizations and get on the phone and on Skype and beg for equipment, beg for protection gear, for medicine, for all kinds of medical instruments to deal with this threat that he saw was coming. And he was so persistent about it that he developed a nickname, which was Chemical Hazm. Hazm means strong-willed or stubborn in Arabic, and that's what people called him. And so you end up following this young man throughout the book, because he goes from being this reluctant activist to later on risking his life to cross into war zones to collect evidence of chemical weapons attacks, including the chlorine attacks that take place after the middle of 2014. And he finds this stuff and he brings it across the border and he delivers it to the Americans and the Europeans. And then nothing happens because chlorine is in this gray area and nobody wants to make a big fuss about it. The Americans don't want to play their cards on what really is an industrial, chemical compound that's being used as a substitute for chemical weapons. And so ultimately he's frustrated and embittered by the experience. But his own stories and the many times I met with him just left a mark. And the opposite end of that, this Iraqi engineer had the unusual experience of meeting this man in prison in the Kurdish area of northern Iraq, in Erbil. The Kurdish authorities let me speak to him. He had been an engineer for the Iraqi government, had nothing to do with chemical weapons in the past, but he was qualified. And so he was rounded up one day and told, "You're going to help us make a new weapon." And he was put to work by the Islamic State making mustard gas, which they devoted a lot of energy and attention to, and they were beginning to make progress. They made weapons that they used. They weren't very good weapons, but they were getting better. But just the early accounts of these weapons being used were enough to alarm the Americans. So they focused a lot of attention and a lot of intelligence power and tried to disrupt it. And this engineer was driving his car through the desert one day, and suddenly a couple of helicopters show up around his car, and it's American Special Forces guys. They start shooting off his tires and then land around him, and a big dog comes out of the swirl of smoke and dust and grabs him by the arm, and off he goes in the helicopter to be the prisoner of the Americans. His arrest, though, ends up being this key moment in revealing this huge network that the Islamic State had set up to try to make chemical weapons. So those are two of my favorites, and it underscores both the sacrifice, the sort of personal hardship faced by Syrians on the ground, as well as why ordinary Iraqis would be persuaded to help a terrorist organization make a weapon of mass destruction. And you meet both those characters in the book.
Fascinating. Thank you for that. Let's pick up on that moment of this Iraqi who helps the Islamic State sort of pursue a chemical weapons capability. You do treat, as you said, this problem of chemical weapons terrorism quite extensively in the book, really, from the early concerns in the Pentagon back in 2012, 2013, when people are really worrying, wow, well, if the Syrian government loses control over this chemical weapons stockpile, it could go really badly, depending on whose hands the stuff falls into. And then later in the book, the pursuit by the Islamic State of an own chemical weapons capability. So with everything that you've seen and heard and know, having written this book, how close did we come to a calamity of chemical weapons terrorism emanating from Syria and Iraq? And do you think that this is an underappreciated issue today?
I think it's underappreciated in hindsight how bad things were and how concerned officials were. And I know this because from the earliest months of the uprising in Syria, the meetings I would have in the region with Israelis and with Jordanians and with Turks and with others, they would talk about this issue. They were worried about the uprising. They were worried about what would happen after Assad falls, and everybody assumed that he would. They were worried about refugees and humanitarian problems, but they were really concerned about the chemical weapons stockpile. Let's remember, this was the only country out of all the countries affected by Arab Spring that had a weapon of mass destruction within its borders. It was a portable one. It's extremely deadly. It doesn't take a physicist to operate. It's you put the stuff in a truck, and with the just a facile grasp of chemistry, you can do some mixing. And if you don't kill yourself, you've got a pretty potent weapon on your hand. So there was a real worry that these weapons would be vulnerable and perhaps plundered. And there were some close calls. There was a period in late 2012, 2013 when some facilities that either had the weapons or were manufacturing facilities were overrun. Nothing was plundered because the Syrians were able to get things out just ahead of these militants. And there are other cases later on in 2014 where people really don't realize this, but the last weapons to come out of Syria were delayed because the base where they were located out in the eastern desert of Syria was literally surrounded by an Islamist army. There had been this retreating army that had come out of the mountains of the east, and they had surrounded this base, and they were prepared to take it. And as the standoff lasted for several weeks, finally the Syrians prevailed, and the rebels were driven back. But on that base were all the stuff that you wouldn't want the terrorists to get their hands on, including sarin precursor and VX precursor. And so when the siege was broken, that stuff was taken out, delivered to the coast, and taken out to sea to be destroyed by the Cape Ray. But those were close calls. And the other part is just, the ISIS part of it, because ISIS likes nothing better than to make a big splash with its terrorist attacks. And there's no bigger splash to make than using a weapon of mass destruction. They years ago decided that nuclear weapons were too hard, at least for a group like the Islamic State. But they believed that acquiring weapons of mass destruction was a religious duty, literally. Osama bin Laden said that himself. And so when they weren't able to get weapons from Assad, then starts this program to try to make their own. And they as mentioned, spent a lot of time and effort, acquired some expertise, recruited a couple of scientists who had once done the job for Saddam Hussein, and put them all to work. And you just look at the timeline, they only had about a year to work at this. You can imagine what would have happened if they had not been stopped, and if they'd not been denied, this territorial, holding that would allow them to have universities and labs and bank accounts and all the things that you need as a state to create a true weapon of mass destruction.
That's great. Thank you for that. I want to zoom out a little bit and speak about the broader picture here that you describe in the book. So having read the book, it appears really that this whole effort, the Syrian chemical weapons disarmament effort, was in the end a mixed success. Yes, on the one hand, we can say that a sizable portion of Syria's most dangerous chemical weapons, Schedule I chemical weapons, were taken out and destroyed. And the world, Syria is a safer place for it. On the other hand, given what we know today, there was continued chemical weapons use in Syria over the years, especially with chlorine, but not only. Outstanding question marks till this very day about what Syria actually declared to the OPCW. We have seen no accountability for chemical weapons use in Syria. And some in the international community would in fact argue today that this inability of ours to deter chemical weapons use in Syria over the years or hold those responsible accountable has led to a broader, or at least contributed to a broader erosion of a chemical weapons taboo in the world. What is your own balance sheet of the Syrian chemical weapons disarmament effort?
Well, I think you're right. You can't look at the events impartially without feeling this is a very mixed story. I do feel on the one hand that you can't understate the value of what did happen in terms of disarming the declared stockpile, because it wasn't just the weapons themselves that were destroyed, it was production capability. These inspectors went on the ground, smashed up, literally in some cases smashed up or tore up with plasma torches, production equipment, machines, storage vessels, all the things that Syria had acquired over many years. And as far as we can tell, that capability has never been restored. So yes, they did keep some weapons back, but they got rid of 90 to 95% of their stockpile, according to CIA sources that I've spoken to. Israelis agree that it's roughly that. And they also lost capability. And so what you see in the years that followed, there were no more sarin attacks in the immediate few years after the removal. And only in very late 2016, early 2017, you see the Syrians start to use a little bit of sarin and a couple of attacks again, but all of them they're using chlorine, which again shows that they had never truly given up their intention to use chemical weapons whenever they felt it benefited them. So the mix is the accountability issue for sure, and the accountability is not just sort of the lack of holding Assad accountable for war crimes, but the inability to really obtain a good grasp of what Syria had and what it did with all of it. The CIA actually had a pretty good baseline because we had, as the book describes, they had a spy inside Syria's chemical weapon programs for more than a decade, from the 80s to about 2002. So they knew a lot in the beginning, but after the declaration was made, the CIA, the Americans, kept pushing the Syrians back on their numbers because they felt they had not admitted to everything. And when the inspectors were on the ground and starting to, open cabinets and sort of kick open, bunkers and look around, they kept finding things that weren't supposed to be there. They kept finding traces of chemicals that the Syrians had never admitted to, like a ricin program, which the Syrians completely denied having, but they found more and more evidence and more records that finally forced the Syrians to say, oh yeah, we tried to weaponize ricin, but we destroyed it all. And you'll have to take our word up with that because we don't have any paperwork to show you that we eliminated it. So that is part of the challenge too. And so at the end of these years later, you see, the persisting problems of no accountability, no, sort of real truthful declarations coming from the Syrians, and a continued use. Even after the Trump administration's military strikes in 2017, 2018, Syria continued to use chemical weapons. So their behavior was not deterred, and the consequence of all that, I'm afraid, is an erosion of the taboo, that this century-old taboo that's supposed to keep countries from using these weapons has been weakened because of the experience of the last decade.
That's great, Joby. And one important part of the puzzle as to why deterrence over the years wasn't restored or failed is Russia. So let's speak a little bit about Russia here. I think your book quite clearly traces how Russia progressively became a sort of less cooperative actor on the Syrian chemical weapons file. You even sort of told us in your anecdotes how the Russians were quite instrumental in getting this thing underway to start with. I mean, not just Russia convincing Syria to sign up to the Chemical Weapons Convention back in the summer of 2013, but even in the operation when there were delays on the ground, Secret Cog would be frustrated with the Syrians. It's ultimately the Russians who pick up the phone to the Syrians and say, guys, you got to move, you have to make this thing happen. But then through the years, Russia becomes more stubborn in the OPCW and the UN Security Council, though there are still brief moments of hope. I was particularly intrigued by your account of this diplomacy involving Samantha Power on the US side and the late Vitaly Churkin, who was then the Russian ambassador to the UN, to make the JIM, this joint investigative mechanism, happen in August 2015. Now, curiously, this is a month before Russia intervenes in the Syrian war, so then things really changed. But I want to ask you, I mean, did the United States miss opportunities with the Russians to steer the trajectory of that Syrian chemical weapons dossier into a different direction? Do you think things could or should have been done differently vis-a-vis Russia? Or was it sort of inevitable that ultimately this narrow Syrian chemical weapons file would fall victim to the broader trajectory of the Russia-West relationship with Crimea, the Ukraine crisis, and everything that has happened since then?
That's an excellent question. And I actually come away thinking that the amazing part of the story is that Russia and the United States had this time of convergent interest that allowed good things to happen. US and Russia certainly had different motivations for wanting to disarm Syria in 2013. The Russians clearly wanted to avoid a US military strike, which they were convinced was coming, even if as they understood and followed US politics and how complicated things got. The Americans believed that the Russians believed that a strike was possible, so they didn't want that to happen. And there was also this opportunity, I think, for Putin to present himself as a real statesman on the world stage, solving this difficult international problem. And so there was this brief moment where it really was the good old days, the late 1990s, which Phil Potter and so many others of you were involved in, where real cooperation on a weapons proliferation issue was possible. But ultimately, and maybe inevitably, there these competing interests guarantee that the countries will conflict. And I think the events that occurred at the time, and you've mentioned some of them, one was Ukraine, of course, the invasion that takes place. There's the Russians end up getting heavily involved in 2015, militarily involved in Syria after things start to go badly for Assad again. And so these two really end up with completely different objectives and interests. And so maybe it was preordained that cooperation would ultimately break down. I don't, I think that that Russia's default position is to defend Assad no matter what. And it's certainly true that Assad, for them, was a red line. Assad's remaining in power was something that they were prepared to support and back it to whatever extent was needed. And so, U.S. Obama saying Assad must go. The Russians want this guy to stay. They don't really seem to be flexible on that, even though a couple of times they seem to suggest that maybe he could be replaced. But really, they never really wanted Assad to go because they didn't have anybody waiting in the wings to take his place, and no one seemed sort of capable. And so they just continued to reflexively back up Assad as we continue to flail away at trying to get rid of him and solve the conflict. And so you end up with a situation where these two countries are completely at odds on everything that has to do with Syria. Maybe not in the future, and we can talk about this later, but things do change, and I get the sense there might be opportunities coming up. We'll see.
Thanks for that. If I might just add, I mean, I completely concur with your analysis here. My own sense, having worked on Russian-Syrian relations for the last couple of years, has also been that really from 2016, this divergence on the chemical weapons file was really explained by the broader trajectory of Russia's growing stakes in Syria. I mean, 2016, we're basically in a period in that war where towards the end of that year, Aleppo falls, Russia creates the so-called Astana format together with Iran and Turkey, and into 2017 creates these so-called de-escalation zones in Syria, and the whole narrative becomes about the war is ending, things are winding down, and we should pursue normalization progressively with the Syrian government, the so-called 3 Rs, rehabilitating the Syrian government internationally, reconstructing Syria, and ensuring refugee return. And to my understanding, I think against that backdrop and against that broader Russian objective, allegations by the international community that the Syrian government actually continues to use chemical weapons against its own people was anathema to Russia, because not only would it embarrass Russia's initial role in delivering in this disarmament effort, which, as you noted, was also a source of considerable pride and status gains for the Putin government, but it would also undermine this whole normalization effort that Russia pursues vis-a-vis other Arab states and vis-a-vis the West. So it really becomes a very entrenched position, I think, in that broader context. Sticking with context just for a second, another aspect of the book that I truly appreciated is how well you situate the Syrian chemical weapons file in the broader trajectory of the Syrian war. And in that context, you also discuss with great nuance evolving American foreign policy on Syria and really the trade-offs that the American government is facing. I recall once discussing this disarmament effort with a senior Pentagon official who was intimately involved at the time. And this official really complained to me that this whole effort in 2013, 2014 was one of, she called it interest dissonance for the US, meaning pursuing one thing, one narrow thing, dealing with the chemical weapons, ran counter to broader US foreign policy preferences on Syria, because to do the disarmament bit, you had to some extent acknowledge Assad as a legitimate and sovereign interlocutor, while there was actually perfect interest alignment for the Russians, because they could claim that in this effort, the Syrian government had been recognized as a legitimate party, and this played out to the advantage. So could you reflect a little bit about these trade-offs that the United States has faced in Syria over time, and whether you think they could have been solved differently?
Yeah, that's a great framing, the perfect interest alignment versus the interest dissonance, because that is exactly right, it seemed to me. And you don't really have to go any further to see an illustration of that. Is just to look at the framing or formulation of Assad must go as a U.S. policy. And I remember I actually was a State Department reporter at the time, and we covered that. There'd been a series of Arab Spring uprisings, and we were just waiting for Obama to say Assad must go, because he'd said it for Mubarak and he'd said it for Gaddafi, and so all these dictators and autocrats were being told by the U.S. that you should step down, you've lost your legitimacy, and the United States saw that as just really sort of the automatic thing to say. We're sort of siding with people who are aspiring for freedom and democracy and denouncing a dictatorship. But there were consequences to saying Assad must go, and some were clear immediately. The allies or the regional allies were looking at this and thinking, what does that mean, Assad must go? Who's going to take his place? And who are these people who are going to take over the government and now be our neighbors? So it's real concern about what that meant. For others, for the Qataris and for some of the other Gulf Arabs, Assad must go meant that there's going to be a military effort to remove Assad, and we're going to get behind our favorite groups. And so you see just tons of money and weapons flowing into this conflict and just making it ever bloodier and ever broader, and just the suffering of the Syrian people escalate. And then as things progress and as various peace proposals are tried and fail, the Russians are pushing for some accommodation, some solution that would let Assad stay in power. But the Americans had committed to the contrary. They insisted that Assad should go, and not just them, but they realized that the rebels, most of the opposition leaders, would not accept a peace accord that would keep Assad in power. And so there was no easy out, and we you can feel for John Kerry and the sort of the later years of the Obama administration just flailing away at this problem with making no progress, and just the people in Syria just becoming more and more delusioned and disappointed about the ability of Western powers to interfere or intervene or just to make their lives better.
Thank you for that, Joby. I want to shift gears slightly and ask you a slightly different question. Now, it seems to me that few international policy problems epitomize this new problem of disinformation or misinformation, or let's call it a war of narratives, really, as well as the Syrian chemical weapons file. I mean, one example that comes to mind is the Russian disinformation campaign against the White Helmets, which you also note in your book, which is a Syrian humanitarian organization, whereas Russia argues that this is a group sort of aiding and abetting terrorists. And to this very day, Russia regularly claims that these groups are staging chemical provocations in parts of Syria that are not controlled by the government. Now, many of us present here, working on arms control issues and international security issues, grapple with this reality in our day-to-day work, this polarized information landscape in which we are conducting our analysis. So I just want to ask you, how do we deal with this new problem? Or, I mean, is it a new problem? How do we deal with it? What's your advice on that?
Yeah, this is something I grapple with as well. And it's, it's not a casual disinformation campaign, that's for sure. It's the weaponization of information to achieve an end. And it's quite sophisticated, and includes, all the things you expect, the sort of attacks against the OPCW, against the UN, but also individuals, people who serve, as leaders of these organizations, get just regularly beaten up and trashed on social media, in articles by sympathetic writers. And then in some cases, even more insidious than that. There were incidents in 2017, 2018, when the sort of the Sergei Skripal investigation was underway by the OPCW, where OPCW officials had their phones wiretapped. They had there were break-ins, all kinds of information, all kinds of attempts to gather information that would be harmful or kind of make them look like they weren't objective, arbiters of facts and evidence. And then it just escalates to specific attacks that would take place in Syria. And of course, the famous one in 2018 at Duma, where an entire narrative develops about why this was not really a Syrian chemical weapons attack. It was something done by the rebels. The evidence was staged. Some evidence was found or trotted out from a draft of an OPCW report that seemed to show some dissent to some of the OPCW's conclusions. All of which looks pretty flimsy on careful analysis and doesn't really hold up to, in trying to present a new narrative to explain what happened in Duma. But this is becoming sort of a common practice. And I must say, and I've written a book now about Syrian chemical weapons, and I see this all the time in my own social media, because every few days there'll be some orchestrated attack against the book, and the Twitter, tirade will just continue for hours and sometimes days, where I can't even look at my Twitter feed, because it's just hour after hour of just endless repeating of the same crap, and it's disheartening. And so what this means really, I think, is it's in a way it's kind of like the struggle that we have as journalists in Washington D.C. these days, fighting against this sense that journalists, by trying to report the truth, by trying to get to the bottom of very complicated situations, if we don't agree with official party line, we're enemies of the state. And you see that here too. So the search for justice in these chemical weapons attacks, the people not only have to overcome evidence barriers, but also they have to fight this war against this propaganda, this false narrative that's been put out. And one has to hope that ultimately truth prevails. But the reality is, if you don't want to see a chemical weapons attack in Syria, if you want to see it as something else, if you're a country that's on the fence and you don't want to make Russia angry, it's easy to accept this contrary or counter narrative and just disregard the evidence. And that just makes our jobs, as truth seekers, much, much harder.
Thank you for that, Joby. I do have a few questions left, but I think at this point I will turn it over to the audience so that they have a chance to ask you questions. And I think to start with, I want to pass the word to Bill Potter, the director of CNS, for some comments or questions.
Thanks so much, Hanna. Let me thank you, Hanna, first for a marvelous job as a moderator. And Joby, it's always a great pleasure to see you and to listen to you. And I really do look forward to your return to Monterey in the not too distant future. I wanted to follow up. There were actually two questions that I had. One of them is a follow-on to the probing that Hanna initiated on the efforts by non-state actors, Al-Qaeda and others, to secure or seize Syrian CW. And I mean, you describe a number of the close calls, but I'm still struck by the absence of an earlier dedicated effort, at least that I'm not aware of a more dedicated effort to acquire those assets. I mean, was this a function of a lack of information until later in the day, or was there simply? I mean, I can't explain it very readily, because it seemed to me that they might have invested more resources earlier on to try to acquire some of those assets until before the later end game in their removal. So that's the first question. And the second question, I mean, I really like the way in which you personalize the story, and I wondered if you could perhaps provide a little bit more detail on the relationships between American and Russian actors who had been so much involved in the earlier years in the CTR program in dealing with not only CW disposition, but other issues in the WMD sphere, which I think can't be understated, or can't be overstated rather, in terms of the working relationship that they were able to put in place early on. I mean, people like Laura Holgate and Andy Weber, who I thought was going to be on the call. I thought maybe he could also join in the discussion here. But could you say a little bit about that on the Russian side as well as on the American side? Because I don't think it's really been developed sufficiently, and I think it did play a role, and you kind of allude to that early on in the book, but I wonder if you had more anecdotes that you could share in that regard.
Yeah, and you're right. I was struck on the sort of the lack of progress that these Islamist groups made in really organize themselves to acquire these weapons early on. And I think there are several reasons for that. And we do see by late 2013, early 2014, there is real intelligence, real solid, intelligence collection that shows there is an intent and they want to get these weapons. A lot of the plots that were disrupted or that were seen as being real and worrisome had to do with attacks on convoys, because there was a period of months in late, mostly early 2014, where big convoys of bad stuff were moving across in disputed areas in Syria, and that was an opportunity for groups like Al-Qaeda. And they organized themselves a bit too late, it seems, because it didn't seem to occur to anyone, or maybe it's just because the Islamists weren't really in place early enough to do something at a time when they could have easily knocked over a military base. The main facilities, there are about 22 core locations for chemical weapons in Syria. Most of them were clustered either close to the capital or around homes, a few up in the Aleppo area, but in what had been government-controlled areas. And later on, you see the rebels moving closer to some of these locations. But by the time they got really within striking distance, the deal was coming together, and an effort was being made to move those out. There's some consolidation that took place. Material moved from one facility to another with a little better protection. But I think we really dodged a big one in the sense that the Al-Qaeda folks did not get their act together until it was almost too late to get something of significance, even though they wanted to, and we know that they tried. On the Russian question, I do think it's, and I'm afraid I don't get into as much detail on this as I could have and should have, But early on, particularly, that that muscle memory, that connected tissue between Americans and Russians who had worked together on these kinds of issues in the past, that became important because long before there was a deal in Geneva to eliminate these weapons, there were some discussions underway between folks like Andy Weber and Laura Holgate and others who had dealt with Russian counterparts in the past. They traded ideas and emails and talked about a possibility of the two countries working together. It seemed crazy at first because no one ever envisioned that the Syrians would actually agree to something like that. And yet when it did happen, some of the building blocks of a removal plan were already starting to take shape. And so, I have to say, I was, you have to be impressed with folks like that who are laboring away, trying to figure out how they could possibly get the chemical weapons out if the time came, and also thinking about technology, because it's one thing to get the weapons out, and then another is what do you do with them, and that becomes the big $1 million question in the middle of the book. Is okay, we're going to get all this Syrian precursor to the port at Latakia, we're going to move it out off the coast. Then what? What country is going to let us build a chemical weapons facility? And the Americans, like Andy Weber, traveled around Europe, went to Albania, tried to get countries to agree to host a facility. No one would do it, maybe not surprisingly. And so they're left with this option, which is we have to destroy them at sea, which was an idea that nobody really liked. And at the end, it was the only idea that was left on the table. And that's what we did. Good questions.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Joby. I do want to open it up more broadly now. I see a number of familiar faces on the screen, including people who've done excellent work on the Syrian chemical weapons issue themselves. Like I see Jeff Knopf, Philip Blake, Chen Kane, my colleague in DC, and then also in Germany, Oliver Meyer and Alexander Kelle, among others. So anyone who'd like to ask a question, please raise your hand. I see Claire Fuchs raising her hand.
Yeah, hello. First off, thank you very much to both of you for this presentation. I personally learned a lot. And I had a question for both of you. In light of the Israeli elections, when we find out who actually won, and then the Iranian elections in June, how do you see the Russian-Syrian relationship evolving based on these elections?
Do you want to take that first, Hanna?
Sure. I mean, this is a question that's somewhat, I suppose, removed just from the chemical weapons issue itself. I mean, to give a short answer to the question, Russia has stood with the Syrian government since the beginning of the Syrian uprising in the UN Security Council. It has intervened on behalf of the Syrian government in the conflict in September 2015, notwithstanding a lot of pressure by Western governments over recent years, including sanctions. And I don't see this Russian position to change at all, notwithstanding any outcomes of elections in the region over the coming year, be it the Iranian, be it the Israeli election. Russia feels quite comfortable with its position in Syria today. Even if Western sanctions, the Caesar Act, are not going away, Russia feels it can live with the status quo in Syria for the time being. It also does not see the Biden administration to show a significant interest on the Syria file going forward. Russia has a somewhat ambivalent relationship with the Iranians in Syria. It doesn't like too much Iranian influence in Syria, but at the same time, it needs the Iranians as a partner on the ground. So really, I mean, all factors considered together, there's no major Russian foreign policy shift on Syria in the offing, as I see it.
The only thing I'll add to that is just maybe one small hopeful note, which is there may be an opportunity, some kind of opportunity related to this, the crisis in Syria, because Syria is in terrible shape at the moment economically, because of fallout from the Lebanese economic collapse, because of years of war. You're starting to see serious unrest in cities like Damascus again, demonstrations against Assad, and that's, you know, there is a sense that the Syrian population might be reaching a tipping point, and if that becomes the case, is there an opportunity for Russia to seek another way out of this? Maybe there's, I honestly can't come up with a good scenario for how it could unfold, but within the Obama administration, folks who are working on this issue, there is some hope that there'll be a window that presents itself just because things are so dire in Syria that maybe that the Syrians will be ready to cut a deal. The only problem remains is it's difficult to see a replacement for Assad, and that seems to always be the sticking point. If you still have Assad, how do you have a fruitful negotiation unless there's a complete capitulation by the Western side and they say, we'll accept Assad as a leader, and there's no indication that NATO countries or the Americans are willing to deal with that.
Great. I see Oliver Meyer having raised his hand. Oliver.
Yeah, good afternoon from Berlin. I haven't, thanks for the discussion and for the book. I haven't finished the book completely, but wanted to ask you a question on the second ally of Assad, Iran, which in the parts I've read so far doesn't get this kind of, isn't described in this ambivalent way that you described the Russian role. But Iran was a victim of chemical weapons in the 1980s. Some of the actions that you described were taking place against the background of the negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal. Did you pick up any ambivalence about on the Iranian side on the chemical weapons disarmament? I heard some people say that in the background, Iranians also helped to push the Assad regime to remove some of these weapons. I'd just be interested in your take on what the role of Iran was in this whole story. Thanks.
That's a really good question, and there are bits of the book that describe this, but not the kind of detail that it probably deserved, because Iran is you can't extract Iran from this discussion and with having the same outcomes. The Iranians, I became convinced from my conversations and reporting, were not happy with the chemical weapons use. They do, as you said, they remember very vividly chemical weapons attacks from the Iran-Iraq War of the 1980s. Many people in Iran, still bear physical scars from those attacks. So it's a visceral thing. There have been some suggestions from Americans I spoke to early on when I was starting to look at this, or that maybe the Iranians helped out with this program and maybe they supplied weapons to Assad. Saw no evidence of that at all, and to the contrary, it seemed that the Iranians were opposed to this kind of the use of this kind of weapon. On the other hand, they weren't real happy to see international teams running around the country. There's some other material that I didn't get to include in the book, in which some of these UN inspection teams on the ground encountered some Iranians at times, and things got a bit stressful, shall we say. But any plan that allows Americans and Brits and others to kind of roam around the countryside looking at things was making the Iranians very uncomfortable. But in the end, if we say the Russians were invested in keeping Assad in power, the Iranians were much more so, and they certainly devoted a huge amount of treasure and troops, much more than the Russians did, because they had their own people fighting and dying, plus their Hezbollah allies propping up Assad during very difficult times, including in early 2015 when the war turned. And so yeah, they're an indispensable part of this, and their role is a bit conflicted, because on the chemical weapons file, they're not big fans, but they are big fans of Assad, and they were absolutely committed that he would stay in power no matter what it took. And that's one of the reasons I think that that Assad was able to hang on. I don't think he could have done it without Iranian help.
Thank you, Joby. I think Chen Kane was next. Chen.
Thank you, Hanna. One question that I have, Joby, is obviously the Syrian and American agreement did not include the Syrian scientists, and what will be the fate of those scientists, and either within find them re-employment or other offers. Do you have any information about what is the fate of those scientists? Did they end up employed within the program itself, other places within Syria, or they are outside of Syria? And that sort of goes back, I think, also to Bill's question, if how come non-state actors did not try to tap on their expertise?
Yeah, good question. And I know that Bill and many others well recall the programs that under CTR to re-employ weapons scientists and to give them jobs either within the countries where they lived or opportunities to travel abroad. In the Syrian case, I know personally, because of my reporting, about a number that escaped the country, and most of them, when they could, found refuge in the West, either in Europe or the United States. And so hopefully they're employed doing positive things now, not working on weapons. There is a prologue of the book. The entire prologue is devoted to one of these scientists, a chemist, this remarkable Syrian chemist who was had a great love for America, had studied America as a youth, and then goes back to his home country, becomes a top sarin scientist, and helps develop their program. Ends up getting recruited by the CIA, and then he is not around, shall we say, to see the rest of the story, because he gets tripped up and betrayed, and the Syrians catch him. But others are still there and working within the program on various things, and this is a subject of continuing interest for me, and as a Washington Post reporter, trying to figure out exactly to what degree the program may have reconstituted. But there's certainly lots of other weapons applications, missiles, other research that the Syrians are involved in throughout a broad complex of military institutions and labs that employ hundreds of people. This is quite a big complex, and many of them are still there. And to the extent that anyone's getting paid and making a reasonable living, they seem to be doing so in Syria right now. But it's a problem in the future, because you're right. These are all people who potentially could be lured to other countries to do the same kind of work. Could be lured by terrorist groups, as people in Iraq were for the ISIS program. And so, if there is a moment in the future where we have the opportunity, it might be something for a CTR-like program to address.
Great. I have Philip Blake next on my list.
Thanks, Hanna. Actually, thanks to both of you, Hanna and Joby. This is really great. So having worked this file for Andy Weber in the Pentagon, I'm very much looking forward to reading the book. I haven't gotten my hands on it yet, but I will be shortly. And the thing I wanted to ask you is kind of an enduring puzzle for me, which is trying to get my head around Assad and Assad regime's calculations around the use of chemical weapons. And Jeff Knopf and others have done some good work on that. But to me, that's still a real puzzle. And it's probably more of a guess for you. I'm guessing you didn't get a lot of direct contact with Syrian regime members who characterized their internal thinking. Maybe you did. And certainly, obviously, Americans and others tried to characterize for you Syria's thinking. But I just wonder where you came out on that. Because I have some thoughts about that, but yeah, I'd just love to hear your thoughts about their calculation in using chemical weapons. Why did they use them? What were they hoping to gain? How did they think about the risks and the rewards of doing so?
Yeah, it's a good question. And Philip, I admire your work. So it's a pleasure to meet you virtually. It's one of the great questions. And it's one of the ones that I spent a lot of frustrating hours trying to figure out. I did feel like after a while that I had a sense, or at least a theory, and that partly comes from conversations with intel people that were trying to solve the same puzzle. And my initial assumptions were wrong, or at least refuted by the people I spoke to. My initial belief was that the early Syrian chemical weapons experiments were an attempt to test the red line, that Obama had drawn this red line. The Syrians felt it was advantageous for them to use chemical weapons, so they were sort of doing these little pinprick tests just to test and see what would happen. I was told by people who really are in the weeds on the sort of intelligence gathering part of this, that Syria's calculations had nothing to do with the outside world, that they made an internal calculation. The first was that Assad would delegate authority to his generals, that he gave them permission to use these weapons if he felt that they needed to, and then sort of signed off on it, didn't get involved in the day-to-day decisions, didn't, for example, order the strike of the Houthi suburbs in 2013. But after these weapons are on the table, the military commanders began to see them as advantageous and felt that they could use them to break sieges, to demoralize rebels, to drive, to have as area denial weapons. And so these early experiments, it was interesting because they shifted from what was originally a strategic weapon, sarin to go into warheads to be fired at Israeli cities, to tactical weapons, which they had to develop. They essentially put sarin inside tear gas canisters at first, and then they used artillery shells that were kind of cobbled together to make them into chemical weapons warheads. And so all these things ended up proving their effectiveness in demoralizing, breaking the morale of opposition forces. the big mistake they made, I think they completely miscalculated with the big attack at East Ghouta, because the intercepts that the Americans later got and analyzed showed that they were surprised by the death toll. They didn't anticipate how many people would die, and the massive international outcry that would result from that. And in the discussions between themselves, there was this anxiety about, we really screwed up now. We're going to get our bosses in trouble. This is going to be ugly. And that just leads me to be more confident in thinking that this was not a calculated effort to try to, to draw a reaction from the U.S. or defy the U.S. It was a screw up in what had been up to that point a fairly controlled experiment to see if they could use these weapons in ways that would, do what barrel bombs were doing, but on a bigger scale. And that's where it came down. I can't begin to claim that that's 100% authoritative, but it was satisfying to me once I figured out that's what it probably was about. Thanks for the question.
Thank you, Joby.
I really appreciate that. I don't want to take more time, but that was perhaps the most nuanced version of that I've seen in the public domain, and I thought it was excellent. So I just want to say thanks for that.
Oh, thank you. It's not often I get accused of nuance, so thank you. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Philip. We've had Sami Shihada waiting to ask a question, please.
Hello, I would like to thank you for this brilliant presentation and for mentioning all the roots and these sensitive parts of the conflict. And I would like to thank you for the book I'm reading, and I'm enjoying every page. Thank you very much. But my question is not as an EPDS student, but as a person who has been born and raised in Syria. My question is like, what do you think is going to happen once al-Assad is going to use his chemical weapons against the Syrians? Do you think, I would like to hear your own perspective of, is there any deterrence mechanism put in place, and especially after the internal war between the heads of the Syrian government? Thank you.
It's a really good question. And I know, I can tell you, I know that the Biden folks have been thinking about this, and they've been having conversations among themselves and also with former Trump administration officials who are working the same file, because there is this possibility that another chemical attack could happen. What does the U.S. do about it? Are we reflexively going to have a military strike? Is that on the table? I don't know this for a fact, but I tend to think that the military strike in eastern Syria along the Iraq border of targeting some pro-Iranian militia groups was in a way the Biden administration's calling card, saying that we're prepared to use force when we feel like it's in our interest to do so. So I don't think they necessarily would refrain. I know that some members of the Biden team were heavily in favor of a military strike in 2013 and felt that the aftermath of the chemical attack in August was mismanaged. So I also know for a fact that the administration is just praying and hoping that nothing happens, because they've got their hands full of so many things. They're trying to get the Iranian deal restarted, and that's not become very easy, as you've all seen. They've got COVID, they've got domestic issues, so they would much prefer not to have to deal with something in Syria. But it's something that's seen as inevitable that eventually we're going to have to do something. I am not completely sure that the Syrians are going to be motivated to use chemical weapons again, just because they pretty much have everything they want except for Idlib. I think they believe they would have the entire country under their control by now, but Idlib has become this enclave that seems to be a fortress that can't be overcome, or the Turks won't allow them to overrun it. And so, but if they've got a stalemate where the rest of the country is relatively speaking under control, there's no real reason to use them. So why agitate? Why anger the Russians and others? So it might just kind of limp along just as it is right now. And I think that would be the great preference of the Biden folks that I've been speaking to. That's a good question.
I mean, maybe just to add to that, Joby, of course, the other area that's not under control of the Syrian government is northeast Syria, east of the Euphrates. But I mean, for the Syrian government to launch anything with chemical weapons there, where you have American troops essentially present supporting the SDF, the Syrian Democratic Forces, with the Kurdish forces being the backbone, that would possibly be a step too far. So the Syrian government might calculate that that is not an advisable course of action. We've had Jeff Knopf waiting, and then I have a few questions in the chat, which I can read out. So Jeff, do you want to go first?
Sure. Thanks, Hanna. And thank you, Joby, for your talk. And congratulations on having the book out. I don't know if you'll remember, but I met with you a couple of years ago at the Wilson Center with my co-authors for a project. We have Wynn Bowen and Matthew Moran, and we're still trying to bring our book manuscript to conclusions. So I'm jealous of the fact that yours is in print. We do have an article, a version of our analysis covering just the Obama years that was published in the journal Security Studies. I have a sort of a comment and a follow-up to Philip's question. I think your assessment of the reasons why the Assad regime used chemical weapons is largely correct and mostly matches our assessment. Westerners tend to think it's all about us, and either we made our deterrent threat credible, and if something bad happens, it's our own fault because we weren't credible. And we, I think, underestimate the degree to which other people are in their own heads. And in Syria, they were very focused on their internal needs, right? That this is a civil war in which they're on the brink of losing, and this is just all about regime survival and what do we have to do to survive in power another day and not get overthrown by the rebels. And what Washington is thinking is not anywhere near the top of their minds. Right? If CW attacks are going to have tactical utility for them, use them. I would say the only other factor was that also they were hitting the upper limits of what they could do conventionally because the Alawites are a minority of the population, so they only had so much manpower, and they were also drawing down their conventional stockpiles in the fighting pretty quickly. So it was also just chemical weapons are the only thing left in the closet that we can take out and use, basically. My question was, did you get any insights into the thinking of the Assad regime in terms of why they said yes to the chemical disarmament deal, right? Our interpretation is that it was, at least indirectly, a result of the plausible threat of a military strike coming from the US one day and the coercive pressure that put, partly on Assad, but partly on freaking out the Russians to not let the US, intervene in the region, drawing, in part on Hanna's wonderful work here. Our critics have argued that actually Assad and Russia were quite clever, and they just outfoxed the Americans on this, and they welcomed the deal all along as a way to legitimize Assad and take the threat of American military intervention off the table. So just wondering, with the people you talked to, if you got any insight, to what extent was Assad unwillingly giving up the chemical weapons and caving into pressure versus sort of just playing a really clever game and outsmarting Obama?
That's the great questions, Jeff. Good to see you, and I really appreciated the work that you guys did. My only advice on finishing the manuscript, and I know you sound like you're pretty far along, is it helps if you don't have to do a team writing by team thing. It's easier when you're by yourself, which is probably why I got mine done. But the real reason for me is the frightening specter of the end of book leave, when you got to go back to your day job, and that is an incredible motivator to get a lot of writing done in a hurry. Plus, the pandemic actually was useful in that sense too. But your really good question. What did Syria and Russia, and did they outfox Obama? I don't think so, really. I think they did want to avoid a military strike. I do think the main motivation for the Syrians was not so much fear of the Americans, because the strikes that did happen later under Trump didn't really do that much damage. I mean, if the intent was not to decapitate, and the Americans never were planning to take Assad out, they were never looking for regime control. They were just looking to punish. Punish means hit a few airfields, destroy a few airplanes. That happened in 2017. The airfields were open and running again the same day, and then chemical weapons were used a few weeks later. So the fear of damage, I don't think was all that great. But the Russian influence, the Russian pressure was decisive, and I got a few windows into that. One is this great nugget that's in the book. It's an argument later on, like I think in 2014, 2015, after the weapons are out. Lavrov and John Kerry are having a fight about some other infraction by the Syrians, and it gets pretty heated. And Kerry turns to Lavrov and he says, "Damn it, Lavrov, and when it came to the chemical weapons deal, you were able to turn the Syrians around in 24 hours. And Lavrov looks back at him and says, "Less." So their ability to grab these guys and force them to comply And then you have these ridiculous statements by I guess it's Mualim and some of the other diplomats, Syrian diplomats, saying, "Oh, but Assad wanted always to get rid of these weapons. He never liked having them. So this is a great idea. We always wanted to do it. So this is kind of our excuse." I don't think so, because this was Syria's answer to Israeli nuclear weapons. They built this weapon system as a deterrent against Israeli, military incursions. And so for them to just give them up, it wasn't something, oh, we're going to outsmart Obama. This was a real capitulation on their part, and a very painful one, I would argue. Thanks, Jeff.
Thank you, Joby. We have a question written out in the chat by Vice Admiral D. Ellen Hoffman, which I'm happy to read to everyone if that's the preference. So he asks, after the Allied attacks of the US, UK, and France against Assad's chemical weapons facilities outside Damascus, this is after the April 2018 Duma attack, do you actually believe that Bashar al-Assad and his Russian/Iranian proxies there started a sincere disarmament process? Or were they just putting on a facade for the international inspectors vis-a-vis a Potemkin village type subterfuge? And that they were simply moving their chemical weapons production to more secure and clandestine sites within Syria with Russian and Iranian funding and scientific expert assistance? I look forward to reading your book.
Thank you. And Vice Admiral, you're referring, I gather, to the disarmament that takes place in 2013 and 14, whether that was a Potemkin village where a false disarmament, if I read that right, correct? And assuming that's the case, I mean, I do believe that whether willing or not, that was a sincere disarmament effort that the Syrians, for complicated reasons, felt obliged to go along with. And the reason that I feel confident in saying that is because, again, the CIA had a pretty good read from 14 years of having a very well-placed spy inside the program. They knew exactly what the Syrians were making. They had physical samples that they had gotten back from their spy. They had a roadmap of all the locations. They knew where the major facilities were. The only thing they weren't quite sure of was how things had been shuffled around in the years between 2002, when they lost their chief spy, and 2013, when the deal was struck. But they had a pretty good sense, and they could also watch, and the Israelis were seriously watching sort of movement and where things were. The reason, interestingly, that Obama issued the red line warning in the first place was because of essentially Israeli intelligence that could see movement of Syrian chemical weapons equipment on the ground in the middle of 2012 rather, in a way that made the Israelis convinced that Assad was about to give some of the weapons to Hezbollah. They sort of warned the Americans that this transfer was about to happen. So it just all goes to show that we had pretty good eyes on this program and a pretty good map of where things were. And so when the inspectors are on the ground, they're inside these facilities. And I am convinced that the Syrians hid some things away, but the idea that they didn't eliminate most of their stockpile and most of their production equipment, I disagree with that, because we are, between our intelligence and just our presence on the ground with these inspectors, we were in too many places for there to be a kind of a full scale ruse that was being played on the Americans and everyone else. That's my personal opinion. I might be proven wrong when next week we discover some massive factory in the mountains outside Latakia or something, but we'll see.
Thanks, Joby. We have a question by Matthew Pacey, who I'm not sure, would you like to unmute yourself and ask the question? Otherwise, I can read it out.
Sure, I will ask it. Thank you. Y'all can hear me, right?
Yes.
Thank you. I'm never sure with my microphone. How do you see the presence of Russian state troops and or PMCs like the Wagner Group and incidents like the 2018 clash between Wagner and American troops with regard to Syrian regime stability and the use of chemical weapons? I don't have a copy of the book yet, so I hope I'm not asking something that's already covered in detail. That's it. Thank you.
I don't go into that particular issue very much in the book. So the Russian-American rivalry in the East. that incident in 2018 was quite striking, and I've talked to a number of Americans who were were participants, shall we say, that had very good eyes on what happened there, and the destruction that was inflicted, and the sort of Russia's sort of grudging acknowledgement of it, and refusal to respond to it in any significant way was a remarkable moment, and it showed the power, I think, of having even a small force of Americans in that part of the country to prevent even worse things from happening. Over my reporting on this book and others, just my Washington Post reporting, I've gotten to know a number of military officers and intelligence folks who have been in and out of this region and have a really good sense of what we do there and how important it is. And they see our presence as really vital because of the activity, not of the Russians so much, but of some of these pro-Iranian militias who, without an American presence, would really have the run of the place. And this idea of a road from Iran to the sea, and a sort of land bridge across Iraq and Syria to Lebanon, it already exists to some extent. It would be essentially a freeway if it wasn't for the presence of these forces. And I feel like that incident in 2018 was just an amazing illustration of the power of this fairly small force of Americans to inflict a lot of damage when there's a conflict or when the need arises. My take.
I mean, maybe I'll just add, since the question was sort of on the role of Russian PMCs, but then also sort of Russian regular troops more broadly, and sort of their association to the chemical weapons issue, that if you look at the, I think, State Department report of last year on the question of compliance by states with the Chemical Weapons Convention, the US State Department certifies Russia as being in non-compliance with the Chemical Weapons Convention. And one of the reasons that's given is actually the April 2018 Duma attack, where the United States essentially argues that Russia colluded with the Syrian government in various ways in the context of that attack, in the sense that Russia helped the Syrians denying and delaying OPCW inspectors access to Duma, but also in sanitizing the location of the suspected attack before they arrived there. So there's some allegations in terms of Russia sort of directly and indirectly being involved in these kinds of attacks, though that, of course, has always been vehemently denied by the Russian side.
And you're correct about Russian involvement in the 2018 Duma aftermath, because I've spoken to OPCW officials who were present at the time, and they described this area denial by the Russians, not allowing them to go into these areas to do a real investigation, and then later essentially covering up and making excuses for the Syrians, and then begins the crazy false narrative that the Russians helped to perpetuate.
Thank you, Joby. I'm conscious of the time. We've been going for 90 minutes. And for those in Europe, it's getting quite late. It's coming up to 11 p.m. So unless anyone has a further question, or Bill, I don't know whether you have any further remarks or questions, I would just thank the audience for their great questions. And of course, thank Joby Warrick so much for being with us today and talking about his amazing book, which I've read from beginning till end and can really recommend. So thank you so much. Have a good evening, good afternoon, wherever you are. And yeah, we hope to see you again at future events of CNS. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.